Christian, you're good to go.
I guess coming off mute is always good. Yeah. Hey, well, thanks for joining us today. This is a conversation on Teams and Office 365 external users with Peter Carson with Extranet User Manager and Vision IT, and Benjamin Niaulin with ShareGate, and myself, Christian Buckley. I'm going to be kind of narrating, walking through, asking probing, deep philosophical questions around the subject matter. But it should be it's supposed to be a little bit less presentation, more discussion around this important topic. So what we're going to do here is we're going to walk through, do some quick introductions, and give you kind of a background of what we're going to be talking about today. So the out-of-the-box external sharing capabilities within SharePoint and Microsoft Teams and groups and Azure, kind of all the components that are part of what Microsoft offers today. We're then going to talk about an important aspect of external sharing, that Teams provisioning and sharing process, and what that looks like, again, out of the box, what that experience is, some of the gaps there, what Azure AD, so Active Directory B2B, those components as well, when you're looking at extending that sharing experience across a larger organization, if you need to automate more of that process. We'll be talking about portals for external users, because this is another across multiple industries. It's an important aspect of external sharing, is creating a landing page, a portal, a place for your customers or partners to go to retrieve a lot of content, and making sure that it is secure and that it is as automated as possible. And then kind of close those out with any other questions throughout, of course. If you have questions, feel free to ask. We'll be monitoring those things, and I'll kind of flag those to Peter and Benjamin as we go through the content. And so with that, so quick introduction. So myself, Chris Buckley, I'm a 8-time Microsoft MVP in Office Apps and Services. So I've been focused on the SharePoint space for many, many years, and very involved in collaboration technology. I'm the CEO of Collab Talk, and we do research and marketing services for the Microsoft community. And I'm also a board member of the Microsoft User Group Utah, and I'm based out of Lehi, Utah.
Cool, thanks, Christian.
Peter.
Peter Carson here, President of Extranet User Manager. You're going to see some similarities here, also an Office Apps and Services MVP. Contact details here, President of the local Toronto SharePoint Users Group. We're going to be sharing the slide deck and the recording up on our event page after the event, so you'll have all of our various contact information as part of that as well.
And hi, everyone. My name is Benjamin Niaulin. I work at a company called ShareGate. Try to do the best we can, or the best I can rather, with the products there, strategy and roadmaps and such. I'm also MVP and Microsoft Regional Director, as Christian mentioned earlier, and been in this for maybe too long now. Originally a lot with SharePoint, but before that I was heavily in Active Directory, and moved to Exchange, then moved to SharePoint. And now it's obviously all coming back together, where if we want to manage an intranet or an extranet, external users, we're in Active Directory, we're in Exchange, we're in SharePoint, and we're also in Teams. So very excited to be here and looking forward to our conversation. Thanks for joining.
Ben, I don't think you can say too long. You don't have the gray in the beard just yet. So.
It's true.
Well, he washes that right out.
Yes. So I'd like to just level set the group a bit first in terms of, external sharing is a pretty broad topic, and Extranet User Manager, we're obviously very focused on this. We talk a lot about what you can do out of the box as well, and really, any style of external sharing, we tend to put into 2 main buckets first. Is it more collaborative sharing, which is often things like, I have a project site and I've got partners or customers that I'm working together on that project, and I want to collaborate on documents, and it's very much a collaborative environment where you're not just sharing documents and pushing them out. You want people to author on them, communicate with you, and do that collaborative modern workplace sort of experience. And then on the other side, the publishing side, this idea of a one-to-many, that I've got content that's still secure, it's still private. I don't want to put it on my public-facing website, but I want to push it out to many, many people, which could be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people. So that's typically more structured, maybe a secure website or part of our public website. There could be things like self-registration, as part of that as well. So those are kind of the two styles. And we're going to actually start first by talking more about the out-of-the-box external sharing side. So Kristen, why don't I pass it back to your side there, and then we can continue the conversation from there.
Yeah, so why don't we start with that? Some of the common scenarios that you guys have experienced. And I know that, Peter, your site has a lot of different industry examples. What are kind of the overarching themes, the common models that you're seeing for the more collaborative, I say unstructured extranets? What does that actually mean? How do you define that?
Well, it's where you've got a couple of people typically. It's not a large group of people. It's very easy to manage. And let's actually use the three of us. Preparing for this webinar itself. We had a chat last week to put the context together. I put some slides together. Of course, late at night, I shared it with you guys and said, hey, you've got 12 hours. Can you update your slides? And I actually shared a link out through here. And that's a perfect scenario of where this collaborative unstructured works really well. Most people have probably seen these dialogues. They exist in SharePoint and OneDrive. They're also there in Teams or even in Windows Explorer if you're using the OneDrive for Business Sync client. And basically, you got different choices about how you share content out. And what I did was I said, I want to share with specific people, and I put Christian and Ben's email addresses in there, said allow editing, applied that, and a custom link got created that I emailed out to them to say, hey, can you update your bio slides, give me some feedback if there's any tweaks that you need to happen on there. And it was really cool because I actually left the presentation open on my desktop in full PowerPoint last night when I went to bed, and got into different meetings this morning, got a ping from Christian saying, hey, Ben and I have updated our bios, and I just flipped over to PowerPoint, and boom, the bios that you saw earlier in this presentation were there with Christian and Ben's info, because they'd used that link to open either the browser or the full version of PowerPoint, doesn't matter, do their updates, and live in that single version of the truth in our SharePoint, that all happened. I mean, that's so much better than the past of, okay, I emailed PowerPoint out to them and they modified their slides and then they emailed it back and I had to merge it together into one document. That all goes away. So that use case is huge to me. I really like that.
If I can add on, and as part of these out-of-the-box options that we're talking about, these choices of anyone, people in Contoso, and people with existing access, I find through my experience, especially in the collaborative world, if we don't, I don't know how to say this in English. I'm losing my English. I don't speak enough anymore in English. Or obviously from Montreal, French side of Canada. It's really the default. What do they mean in the sense that as administrators, often we researched it or we've set it up so we understand them. But I found through my experience that a lot of end users are just, if they're left in front of these, they're working, they have files in OneDrive or in their team site or Teams now and wherever, they click share. And I've seen a couple of times where if I don't explain to anyone at any point what they mean, they tend to mistake this box. I'm using my cursor, but obviously no one's seeing it. If we look in the left rectangle where you have send link and you have anyone with this link and view already selected, which is in this behavior the default, because in the settings the administrator can change what's the default, and I highly recommend that you do, because a lot of end users just going to enter a name or email address and they believe that they're sending or they're sharing to these people. When they click share, I've seen where they just type in the name of the people they want to share with and then they click send. What they didn't realize is that they weren't creating a share, like sharing this file with just these 2 or 3 people. They were actually creating a link that gives anonymous access to anyone in the world to access this document if they get the link. Now, granted, the link is only sent to those 2 people, but in terms of security, I find it's very important for us as whoever's setting all of this up to not only understand what does it mean, specific people or people with existing access, but also to set up so that they provide the out-of-the-box experience as much as possible to be the default. So sometimes I often just change it to the default being specific people, and then people have to select people in Contoso, or then if it's enabled, choose anyone. What do you think? I don't know.
Can I say that it's a common scenario where an admin may, because he sees this sharing out of links, and may shut down external sharing rather than change that default, as you point out. And so there's kind of the opposite extreme reaction.
Yeah, we've seen that
to
as well.
So I actually like this people with existing access as the default. And this was a pet peeve of mine, is you couldn't actually set that as the default. You still can't set it globally on the tenant, but you can go into each site collection that you can create and say, I want people with existing access as my default. The reason I like that is that when I'm, rather than sending a link, I just want to copy a link. Often I'm actually sending that to my peers within the organization, and I don't want to set up any special permissions. I just want to get the link to the document and send it to them so they can open it. They already have access. So that one really works well for me. And I agree with Ben that I wouldn't leave it as a default on anyone, because that's probably the most dangerous one to have default and people not understand what they're doing. But the flip side of that anyone freaks a lot of people out, particularly IT administrators and security folks are like, well, you can't have links that are available to anyone. But if you think about it, okay, the alternative is I take a document and I attach it to an email and I send it to people. Well, as soon as I've done that, I've lost control of that document, because they can forward that document on to anybody else. Unless you've got rights management in place, which most people don't, you don't have any control there. The anyone link is actually a better way of doing that, because not only are we still having that single version of the truth that we talked about in this PowerPoint deck is so powerful, but you still have control. I've shared that link out and I say, wait a minute, I don't want to share that anymore. Or I want an expiration date on it, or I want to revoke it. You can still do that. But people can freely share that. And if that's actually what you want, that you don't know everybody you want to share it with, but you tell two people and they tell two friends and they tell two friends, sort of thing. That style of sharing actually is really powerful. So I encourage people not to turn that one off, but just to be careful and not make it a default, and make sure people understand when and how to use it.
That's an interesting point. To be honest, I myself, I tend to be very wary of that one, because it says anonymous, right? And I'm always scared by default. And I think your point of view is actually pretty interesting. Is what's the, you actually lose more control by people clicking download offline and then sending it via email attachments, or even worse, some other third-party app. Or so
Exactly.
actually, very interesting. Not default it to something else, like specific people or people with existing access, and then leave it available, but coach users in what that means to have anyone have access, or show them the set expiration. Very interesting, to be honest. Thanks.
Yeah, and maybe Microsoft needs to change the language.
I think we've identified an infographic where we have the at one side we've printed out the material we want to share and left it on a table at Starbucks, being the one extreme, and then the curve goes up. At email is just slightly more secure than that, because you share it out once and you lose control of it over that, and it really comes to the level of control that you need to have over the content with each of these options.
Yeah, Microsoft actually has a nice infographic to explain this scenario that I often use in sessions, and it's really people understanding this, with the link, those 3 words are actually really important, because you're not sharing it with the world. It's not discoverable by anybody. Somebody has to give you that link. So there is some trust associated there, and where you go from there. But in the case of the deck, I did what you mentioned, Ben, is I shared it with specific people and put yourself and Christian in, because I knew those were the only 2 people that I wanted to work with me on this presentation. I debated. I actually thought, what if we run into problems? Because we'll talk in a minute about, how a new sharing user gets onboarded and what their experience is. But I figured, you know what, Christian and Ben are pretty savvy on Office 365. They'll figure this out and they'll get into the document.
Absolutely. I think it's very interesting. And basically on the last note before we move on is really, when you start working in collaboration in terms of an external sharing, just be mindful of what they look like basic settings, but just be mindful of what they mean, what the default should be, and how you want that to be experienced for users, for your company, because there's a lot of nuances that I discovered over time, really at first, because other than specific people, what you're doing is actually creating a link that has the key inside of it that grants access once people click on the hyperlink. Whereas when you're just adding specific people, or you're just adding them to the document themselves, there's little different behaviors that happen that you want to be mindful of. So even these very basic out-of-the-box settings, it's important to understand it, and then it's important to understand what the default should be for your organization.
Right. Cool. So why don't we switch gears? This is another kind of cool feature I use. Curious, both Christian and Ben, your thoughts on this one. You know, let's say I was a little more anal and I didn't want to share my whole deck with you guys. I wanted you to just send me a one slide deck with your bio that I can insert in because I don't want you touching any of my slides. I trust you guys. I didn't do that, but as a scenario, you know, I could go into my OneDrive and actually create a file request, which is a special private link that I can share with as many people as they want, and they can just use that as a black box to drop their files into. Do you guys use this at all yourselves?
Yeah, actually reminds me of the drop-off library. I can't say that I use it all the time because in many cases I'm working with my team and we are inside a Teams with a team site, and I just give them access or a link to the folder where we're working. So it really depends on the scenario. However, often when we see a feature like this in OneDrive for Business, then I tend to think that eventually it could come to a document library in a team site. So I'm definitely looking for that as well on that front. However, when I'm working with external people, like especially in the scenario you were talking about where you knew you were working with me and with Christian, there is where I use the scenario a couple of times where I'm working with a customer, I'm working with people outside, such as researchers, or you know, we're doing user testing and such, and I want them to upload certain data or a certain information. I definitely enjoyed using this, but less often than I would have expected. I don't know about you guys.
I tend to agree. I also agree on your other point. You know, I kind of wish that it existed on a general document library as part of a team, for example, as well, rather than just my OneDrive. But, you know, same scenario, working with a client, they've generated some big files that they need to provide to us as part of a project we're working on. This is a great way to say, here, just drop them in here, we'll get them.
Yeah.
Don't worry about trying to email them to me or other things. This is just solid and simple. They don't even need to sign in. You know,
Yeah, I find the
easy,
experience is
friction-free.
nice and friendly, especially for people that don't want to understand what's going on. A lot of the times, or in the scenarios with that where I've lived, we're actually a team, or we're unstructured but structured in a sense where we were a team working in a space, and I just simply provided the link to the space. But what I like about this experience is that it's made to remove all of the noise of that team site or the OneDrive or the SharePoint, the everything, and just say, look, click this, here's a square, drop your files, thank you very much, right? So,
Yeah.
so the experience is definitely something I really enjoy, and depending on who I'm working with and what's the context, it's something that I will use. But a lot of the time, if I'm collaborating, we are in the space, I've added them, and we'll speak again about guests and external membership, but I tend to add them this way, or I'm working on an existing document. So a little bit different behavior, but yes, definitely
Yeah.
used.
How about yourself, Christian?
So I had the same reaction as Ben. I mean, the first thing I thought of when they announced this was the drop-off libraries, which, you know, disappeared a while back. I used to talk about that a lot. I loved that feature for some of these core scenarios. Look, I think most people reacted the same way, saying we have a similar capability. Like I could just share out a link to a folder that I've created in OneDrive. This is just it's a streamlining of that capability. It just keeps it, as you said, it reduces the noise, makes it simple. You're requesting files from a person. They have that direct line, that link into this location. That's its purpose. If you're going to be doing more collaboration ongoing with a person, then this is not the right solution. It's an option for, like I've used it in that exact scenario Ben mentioned with researchers, with the part-time researchers that I have in the last project that I did. That's how we used it. They just said, here's a link, upload this content, these files over to it. Keep that link or time bomb that link. But just keep it really simple for these researchers. But all they know is that here's the one place they need to go. They don't need to go in anywhere, navigate to anything, just that streamlined use.
I think the key thing for me too is the second point here, that they only see their own content. So let's say you've got 100 people you want to collect things from. You don't want to create 100 folders and share each one with one person, but you want to make sure they can't see each other stuff. This actually really hits that use case really well to say, okay, it's a single link you can use for everybody, but they can't see what each other are doing. You know, so if you've got 100 external parties that you want private confidential stuff dropped in, it keeps it private from that point of view.
There's a good question while we're still on this topic from Warren that says, is there a way to create a this send a file request on a person's OneDrive through PowerShell? I personally am not familiar with any PowerShell commands, as I don't play that much with it. I don't know if you guys have any info on that.
I haven't looked at that one. It's an interesting one. You've piqued my curiosity now, and I'm going to need to look at that.
Sorry, Warren, we'll get back to you. We'll try and find the answer for you, but I don't know. Good question.
Yeah, absolutely good question. Whoops. So Ben, you were talking about defaults and how important it is to set them appropriate. I mean, there's a number of spots you need to go to set up external sharing. This is, in my mind, is the most important one, which is what's kind of the standard default that you need to have across all of your SharePoint sites. And you can tweak it within individual sites. The key thing for me is that however permissive you want it to be on any one site, you need to make it at least that permissive here. So this is kind of, okay, nothing can be less secure than what I've said in here. I can make things tighter from here.
Exactly.
I mean, how do you tend to set this one up?
Personally, to be honest, I'm looking at it, and I also play in the more external sharing settings that's currently a bit, the drop down that we have under the SharePoint and OneDrive, because there's certain aspects. So everything I see is definitely where I'm usually set. The expiration links, I think it depends on the organization and what's the default that we put. It really varies on the company. But I find in external sharing, there's also things like whitelisting or blacklisting certain domains, or there's certain aspect that depending on the company, we might have to go deeper into what do we allow or not allow. And I know we'll talk about, because what's interesting is that these are the default settings for sharing inside of SharePoint and OneDrive, but it's so interconnected to other places where you have to have default settings as well. Some of them are in Azure AD, some of it is in collaboration with Teams, and so really playing everywhere. But in terms of these over here, we often, like you said, start from what is the most permissive that you're kind of like group policies. I'm going back to my Active Directory days where you get narrower and narrower and narrower on the specific object. So you allow everything here, or you set a group policy for the entire domain that everyone has a password expiration policy that is this. And then as you get closer and closer to specific objects, then I add my restrictions or add my additional context. But that can come in many forms, which is why it's becoming interesting, because there's the settings.
There's a lot of places, yeah.
There's a lot of places, but some of these, for me, I figured a bit where the admin centers are my settings on, off, and the behaviors that I want through for security, I tend to start going more and more into the compliance center, where I'm going to have more behavioral guidelines or settings. I don't know how to express myself very well on that, but where we'll say, well, if this happens, start doing this, or the privacy policies or whatever else, and where I want the on or off, external yes or external no, or allow this or don't allow that. This is where I'll be looking at these settings. I don't know, I may be going a little bit off topic from your original question.
No, but that's okay.
There's definitely a lot going on and a lot of things to look at.
I mean, the point I like to make to people is that, if you think there's at least one site anywhere in your tenant, present or future, that you're going to want to use in any one link, and we had talked about where that can actually be a really useful link. I see this as both a challenge and something people need to understand is on this page here, you have to set that SharePoint up to that most permissive state. And what that means is every SharePoint site that I create by default is going to have that anyone sharing available on it, unless I go into that site and change that. And that's a really important thing to remember, that, okay, if 99% of our sites shouldn't have that anyone link on it, but 1% of them should, I need to turn it on here, but then on 99% of my sites, I need to remember to go in and turn it off on those sites. And that's something you really need to bear in mind.
So I'm curious.
I think it is important to, I was going to say, I think it's really important for people to understand kind of the extreme of how, because Ben, you talked about how interconnected the different components are. What happens when sharing is turned off? It's actually very widespread. So you think about it, and there's going to be varying degrees of effects based on the level of sharing there. But think about it. If you, for some organizations that say, why am I going through the headache? There's these specific scenarios for a limited number of people that need to go and do this external collaboration, external sharing. Why don't we just turn it off for the entire organization? Well, certain things happen. I mean, SharePoint Home is disabled because all the settings are stored in the OneDrive cache. That's part of that. Followed sites, shared with me lists are disabled. Modern attachments are entirely disabled. The Team site and Microsoft Teams sync to OneDrive, that's disabled. The OneNote sync is disabled. And also the case, if there have been any external users who are invited to view or edit content, they will then be blocked. And there's a degraded experience that happens as well by turning off sharing. The modern attachments becomes unavailable in SharePoint. The graph will seriously become crippled in what it's capturing because it relies heavily on what's being shared, what's being viewed, and as providing part of that rich experience. And so you'll still see like the most recently used list of content, but it won't have the insights from the graph and delve and other capabilities. So it seriously hobbles a lot of the core features that we use as part of Office 365, Microsoft 365.
I was just going to touch on a question from Neil about, he mentioned, okay, I've seen this set to allow all, but somewhere else blocking it. So really that's here. So I've gone down a level from the global SharePoint tenant level and said, okay, I've picked a particular site and I've gone into the policies, not the permissions, which is a confusing piece in the admin, to define what the sharing policies are. So here I could say, you know what, at the tenant level, we've allowed anyone, but this one here, I only want existing or only people in my organization, so you can tighten it down on other sites here. And that's what I was referring to, is that you need to make it wide open in general, but you also need to make sure you come in here and set it appropriately to the different spots from there. And this is actually where you have the ability to say, hey, I want to use that, people with existing access. You can't do that globally, but you can do it on individual sites from there.
Yeah. Can you, while you're here in the admin center, under policies in the left-hand navigation to go to the sharing settings, and then go to more external sharing settings, because there's a few things there that I find are also worth noting, like limit external sharing by domain. And again, it's not every organization, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that, but particular use cases will, I mean, the option is there. It's more what I'm saying is for those that want to block specific domains for, it could be competitors, it can be you're currently looking into
consumer
or information
domains,
bar,
yes,
what have you, you may have it. But what I like as well is the guest must sign in using the same account to which sharing invitations are sent, or the verification code. There's a couple of options that could be, depending on what your needs are, things that I come and play around here, as well as the verification code for reauthentication.
And thank you, Ben. This is one I drill on, is that I'm a big fan that this should always be set, and I just realized our demo tenant doesn't have it set, so I'm gonna hit OK on this one.
Absolutely, it's definitely one of the default settings for me, is because in the past, what would happen is it was a pane that was yes, so you click on save and I said save. In the past, people would have you'd share it with someone, and then they could technically take that invitation and forward it to whoever they wanted, because the link that granted access is in the email rather than to you as an individual. So this method ensures that only the email to which you shared to is the person that can log in using the code and so on. So definitely my favorite feature to make sure that you got the right person coming in. And if they change company, or if you shared it to their Gmail and then they switch to somewhere else, in other words, you make sure that the person that's coming in from outside is the person that you wanted to share this to, and still works where they worked when you send it to, because they could have moved to a competitor and no longer have access to the email you send it to. And in this method, you're actually ensuring that that's working. I did have one question for you. You talked about in the sharing setting, the default sharing settings, I think you had the use shortened links for sharing, I think. I
Right.
forget exactly what it's called. And I wanted to
It's
see
like
if
a Bitly link, yeah.
yeah, and what were your thoughts around that? If you used it, if you didn't, what your recommendations were?
I mean, I've got it turned on in this one here. I'm trying to think in our sort of live real production tenants, whether I've got that on there or not. I do like the idea of it just because, some of these sharing links can get,
Yeah,
4 lines long in the email when you paste them in, and having a shortened version of that is a nice thing to have. I mean, there's
yeah, no,
always
I
that
just wanted
concern
to see
of,
if
okay, where is that pointing to? And, there's always that phishing concern of, oh, I don't know what that link points to, and should I click on it or not? So you got to balance those two
exactly.
things.
I think that was a little bit my thoughts around this is it. I guess it really falls down to what you prefer in your organization or what you want, but it's exactly that point is the URL includes kind of an indicator of where the file is located. How comfortable are you? I find Office 365 to be fairly secure, but of course the number one rule is to not show where things are stored. So I mean, use at your own discretion, right? I haven't seen any issues to fall out from using short links, at least in my experience. But it does hide a bit where the file is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So interesting comment from Christopher Thompson. Not so much a question, more just kind of sharing a use case he's done, which I'll just share out with the group as a whole. So what they've done is created a Power Automate. So somebody fills in a Microsoft form, triggers a Power Automate, that creates a folder in a SharePoint library, creates a sharing link, and then part of the form was who do you want to share this library with, and it generates the sharing link for them and emails it out to them. So kind of simplifying that to say, okay, we don't want people to make those decisions and maybe make them wrong as to how they're sharing. Let's build a business process around that. I'm a big fan of Power Automate, Flow, whatever you want to call it, and doing those sorts of scenarios. And in fact, using Microsoft Forms as a front end to that is a nice way too, because Forms is so easy to create, quick and dirty online forms like this and wire it into some business process.
That's a really good point, and I find I agree, and at the same time, I want to be careful with those scenarios. I 100% agree, and I love the use case. And again, it depends on the scenarios. My only, in terms of collaboration, the only thing I would say, just to be sure, is to be mindful of, depending on how many end users you have or people you work with, that's going to be using the feature. Because what tends to happen is more and more people want to be in self-service mode. They want to be able to quickly build something, create something. And depending on the flow that you create, so in this case, if it's a form that goes and automatically creates the user's desired outcome, which is a place that's shareable, then perfect. As soon as you start having approvals and waiting for IT to make sure they look over it, that's where you insert a point of friction. And I know Peter and I, we have great conversations around that topic, so perfect. And that's where, in terms of collaboration, where you want high team velocity, it's where you have to look at how much of that process will possibly make the people go towards something else. So you got to, they may go to OneDrive, and then worse, they could go outside. But if the flow really creates the desired outcome for them quickly and gives you what you needed to make sure it's protected, then perfect. But in terms of collaboration, that's where I'm always kind of making sure in this flow, it looks like the form just goes and creates the right thing, which is perfect. But I mean, it was a good conversation point. I know we talked many times about that, Peter.
Yeah, if I can kind of expand on that, I mean, my thought is that I wouldn't like to see this as the only way people can share. I see this, if you've got a very specific business process that you've mapped out, we want A, B, C, D done as part of what we're doing as an organization, and you can use Flow to do that, and sharing becomes part of that. Awesome, but don't turn off the out of the box, because I agree with Ben. There's going to be those unstructured, ad hoc type of scenarios, and I totally agree. You don't want gatekeepers or limits around how that collaboration happens.
I definitely
I think
agree.
there's
Though
a
you want
lesson.
to go ahead.
I was going to say, just really quick, I think there's an important lesson here that unfortunately organizations are having to relearn this lesson over and over again, is that there's not one way to do this, to listen to your end users and be ready to make some adjustments based on their needs. And you may learn about the culture of sharing within your organization that is different than what you've initially deployed. And you may need to go back and make adjustments and try some different things. So.
Hey, come on, this is Microsoft. They love to give you at least 6 different ways to do the same thing. Not that that
that's the
confuses
thing.
anybody.
They want to know, like, they want Microsoft to be very prescriptive. Tell me the one way to do this. And Microsoft to come back and say, the right way to do it is what fits your organization. So here's different ways that you can do that. And people get confused by, the so many menu items.
Yeah.
But you have to do some of that homework yourself and figure out what fits for your culture.
And this is where Ben and I have had lots of chats and had some really good conversation with clients too on this topic of how do you go about provisioning without eliminating that sort of ad hoc creative flair that you want in your organization. And the way we position, I mean, we do a lot of work. We've got a whole open source project here around Teams provisioning, is that we're not trying to lock people into a particular way of working. We're trying to encourage a particular way of working. That, hey, if you want to start a new team, rather than the blank slate, if organizationally there's certain tabs you want to see, you want to use OneNote or Stream or Planner as part of that in a particular way that's consistent across a lot of projects, you're not telling people they have to do that. But if you make it easy for them, and you say, you know what, if you do this, we're going to create it for you, and it's all set up in a consistent way. So as you move from team to team to team, it's very easy to understand. That's a good thing. You haven't locked it and said you have to work that way. You kind of encouraged it from that point of view.
Yeah, 100% agree. I think we had great conversations, and I think back to last week, because at first we were like, wait, do we agree on this or you not agree? And I think ultimately we're definitely aligned. But it came to the point where, we were talking about different ways to doing it. And ultimately, I mean, this is definitely one solution of provisioning, and I 100% agree with it, where what you want, right? When we say governance, sometimes or typically a lot of people think about, this ultimate list of what you should be doing. But really what you're trying to do for your organization is, govern in the right direction or steer.
You're trying to guide, yes.
Exactly. You're trying to guide and steer people in that this, what you think is the best direction is what, we think of government, we think of governance, we think it's always supposedly to go and steer towards the right direction. And through templating, there's site design, site scripts, there's different ways of doing it manually. There's solutions out there, some great ones here that are really like, what are you trying to do? And let me help you put the things in place that will help you do it. And I find there's different methods, and that's where at first we were discussing where, I think we were talking about forms and we were talking about how do we enable this to happen. But I 100% agree. You want to enable people to get to their desired outcome as fast as possible, however that may be. And there's different ways, a Teams template and so on. Definitely ways of doing it.
And I want to come back to our earlier conversation, the point I made where you need to make this as permissive as possible. And then as you create each team, that you lock it down as appropriate for that. I mean, that's where the provisioning becomes hugely valuable in my mind. If I've got a chief security officer at an organization that says there's no freaking way that the default is going to be anyone can share anonymous links on sites that may have private confidential internal information. Well, if you can say, well, by default, that's actually going to get turned off on each site that gets created unless there's some specific rules, and maybe those ones do need to go through an approval because they're super secure, and maybe they have to have a prefix so it's clear to everybody that's an externally shared site so that they know when they put content in there, it could go to external parties. That makes the CSO a lot more comfortable from that point of view.
I 100% agree. You want to enable people to get work done, right? So the idea is, how do we create that space for them by removing as many barriers or friction points as possible? Because I want them to work in Office or Microsoft 365. I want them to work there. And I want the tools that we put in place to serve them to do more. Now, the idea is, I also have to worry about security. I have to worry about making sure they understand what they're doing to make sure that they get this desired outcome. And that's where I 100% agree with you is, yes, make it permissive, but work with the right people to make them understand that there's going to be behaviors that will drive the settings, the defaults, whether it's depending on the template that they choose, the classification that they select, the tagging, whatever the case may be.
So I just realized I left an entire slide topic out that I wanted to touch on. That's really important, which is, we've been very focused on document sharing and bringing in users from a document collaboration point of view, but there's the broader teams. Hey, I want to do more than share documents. I want to actually have conversations and communicate as well as collaborate. And this for me is a touchy one because I'm sure Christian and Ben, you're the same as me. I belong to a dozen or more different Teams tenants. I've got several Microsoft ones, including the MVP one. My challenge is today with Teams, my main Teams app can only live in one of those tenants at a time, and I need to flip between them. I use Chrome profiles to manage multiple teams at the same time, but inevitably I miss stuff because I'm just not getting a single activity feed or a single way to see that. So I'm very nervous about inviting people in as full-fledged members of the team as external users, because I think, well, if they use Teams themselves, they're going to get caught in that same confusion, and they're just not going to see what's going on back and forth. I mean, what's your thoughts on that side?
Yeah, 100. I mean, it's hard to disagree, right? Because we live it every day as users ourselves. But I see it with customers is the experience of switching Teams tenants is definitely where you start to lose participation and engagement from the people invited. And this happens all the time. I haven't really seen a successful scenario where that behavior's corrected, if you will. I think it's definitely a pain point that's been identified, I believe, by Microsoft, and hopefully they'll come up with solutions for that soon. But yes, I think the way I separated, earlier you separated collaboration and communication or publishing in terms of sharing. I find there's also the layer of, membership and sharing. That's two different layers for me as well. I can manage membership, so who belongs where, and then I can manage sharing, so authentication and authorization almost in that case. And in terms of guests and membership, I enjoy it. I want them to be part of it. Obviously, I would rather, for me, if I just think about myself, I want them in my Microsoft Teams, and I want them to have the conversations about my project where we're having conversation about the project. But if I have empathy for that person for 2 seconds, I know that they're not going to see because they won't be in that tenant. So we'll be missing out. And I do find it a bit of a challenge in that scenario. I haven't found a solution to that particular problem other than workarounds, right? So emailing or stuff.
We tend to email. I mean, there's some very highly voted user voices for Microsoft saying, please fix this, make it better to be multi-tenant. We know they're working on it. We just, we don't have details to share just yet from that point of view. But yeah, keen to see that because we tend to go to email. We have one big client. We've got about 8 of our staff in their Teams tenant, and we're actually working really well together as a cross-company team. But all of us keep another Chrome profile open with that team so that we can be active in both teams at the same time. It's tough to manage, and it's not scalable to lots of different external tenants.
Absolutely.
I mean, just switching gears, you made the point.
There's been quite a few conversations around feature development in that area. So I would say that without talking about specifics, of course, Microsoft is keenly aware of that issue and are working on a number of things to try and remedy that problem, especially because I think the more that you use Teams, like you said, a dozen or more guest networks that I'm in at least 2 or 3 times in a week, if not daily.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to keep up with all those things. So
it's a challenge.
Yeah. Advice is really just be mindful that your idea of having this external guest as part of the team or project or team or collaboration is just be mindful that it's likely not going to get a high engagement or participation because it requires a context switch from the tool that they're using, right? So that's the challenge. So that's the only thing, I guess, at least from my point of view, that's my advice.
Yeah. I mean, I'm going to go back to a question Greg asked a little while back that I'd kind of been holding for this part of the conversation, which is, how do I create a SharePoint Online site that's a bit more social, using features like Teams as part of that? And that gets into this concept of structured extranets. I'm not sharing an individual PowerPoint presentation or an individual folder of documents. I want to bring somebody into the site as a whole. And maybe we're not ready to bring them into our team, but I want to bring them into our communication site or modern team site and be a full-fledged member from that point of view. I mean, I'd love to see a web part from Microsoft that lets me put a Teams conversation right into that site, because that kind of eliminates the context switching issue that, yeah, they don't need to be in that team all the time and responding, but when they come to that site and they're part of that community, that there's a way to have sort of a chat log discussion that's going on in there. And Teams is the perfect place to have that under the hood. We could moderate that through our own Teams stem and be very responsive to it. The site visitors don't necessarily need to be notified every time somebody posts something in there. I mean, Christian, thoughts on that side, stuff coming down the pipe from you know, the ability to do those sorts of things?
As far as new features that are coming out, I'm always nervous about talking about, was this?
I know there's an NDA line we can't cross. Yes, I'm not going to force you there.
No, I mean,
I guess
it's,
do you share the same thoughts that, hey, having a, you know, sort of a discussion board on a SharePoint site that's actually driven by Teams under the hood would be an awesome thing?
oh yeah, no, for sure. It's, I mean, look, every project seems to be different, but having that shared location, having, you know, the concepts that make Teams incredibly powerful, it's not a surprise that it has skyrocketed its growth since it was launched to become one of Microsoft's fastest growing products in history. Because
and that's before COVID took it off like this. Yeah.
Right, yeah. And that's right. I think it did attain that, you know, well before COVID. But and then it was what, 750% growth since then. Right. But it was this idea of, it's not just about, you know, document collaboration. It's the conversations that are in context. It's having that shared space, the shared calendar, the ability to tie in all of these other third-party applications as tabs and integrations in to automate as part of all those activities. And, you know, we used to talk about in the SharePoint space about, you know, SharePoint was this Swiss Army knife solution. It never really was. You know, we would go and create solutions that were not really a fit for SharePoint, but we could do it. And it was really kind of the precursor for Teams, because we were trying to bring all these different pieces together, all these third-party solutions. We now have that capability. So, you know, you might have you know, I have a project management background. I might work on, you know, 10 different projects with 10 different groups of people, 10 different sets of stakeholders across those things, and not have to treat every one of those projects, every one of those collaborative activities as the same thing. Being able to go and have similar activities, but fine tune the experiences for each one of those to meet the needs of those projects and constituencies is pretty powerful.
Yeah.
And to go back to the point is, yes, it would be great, I find, to have those conversations integrated. I think currently in some cases, and if you're a company that uses Yammer, they've updated Yammer quite a bit, that allows, you know, such web parts to have some conversations there. It really depends on the use case. One workaround that's not perfect, but if you have such a structured extranet, I find, where your customer or external person will go to that site, like there is value for them to, oh, I need to go there, there's a trigger, they go there. There is a workaround where you can actually create a hyperlink that will drive them as a web browser, right, to your Teams and to that conversation area. So of course, right, they'll click, they'll likely have to log in again, and there might be some issues in terms of logging experience. But if they actually logged into your intranet, to your extranet, and they're there, you could trick the experience, even though there's no web part to embed that into the page or into the context of the page, which would be ideal. You could trick it through hyperlink experience to bring them to another tab that will go to the right conversation. But the other way around, where earlier we're talking about more collaboration, where you want the conversation to be first and the files you're working on next to them, that I find it's tougher because you don't get that engagement. But if your extranet brings people, then you can bring them or accompany them through the web browser experience to the Teams full web experience. But that's a workaround.
I like your point about the Yammer web parts. I mean, they're exactly what we're looking for. If we can do the same thing in Teams, that would be perfect. So I'm sure they're working on it, but just not there
Yeah,
yet.
sure, but it looks like they're really more on the other way around. I mean, personal opinion. I don't know what their the NDA roadmap is, but it looks to me that it's more how can SharePoint go towards Teams rather
Right.
than how can we bring Teams to SharePoint, at least from what I've seen being released. So I don't know. Honestly, if I could share, I would share, but I have no idea.
Yeah.
Well, the
there's an
Lists
important.
app is a great example of exactly that, Ben.
Mhm.
Where it's one of the most popular aspects of SharePoint, the Lists app that's been announced. But it's being productized and being brought over to Teams, and is becoming less of let's admit, it's mostly admins and people that really understand and live inside of SharePoint that kind of understand the power and capability. And now it's kind of democratizing the usage of lists and providing it in a fully integrated in way. So anyway, that's a great example of the direction Microsoft is going to try and make things more user friendly and easier for anybody to go in there and collaborate and use that capability.
But I'm going to twig in a different direction off that last point, which is user experience. It's something I'm personally really passionate about. And you think about these external people that are coming in that maybe don't use Teams at all. They're not familiar with Office 365. Like, how do we make that as simple a user experience as possible? And one of the things they've done is to their kudos, streamlined the onboarding experience, because this was a big pain point in the past. That hey, if I came in, invited me into your Office 365 portal and I didn't use Office 365 today, it would force me through this creation of, we actually called them zombie AD accounts. Microsoft doesn't like us calling them that, but it would create these phantom tenants and you'd set your password and do all that kind of stuff in there. They actually lit up a preview feature about a year ago, which is this one-time passcode that I'm a huge fan of. It says, you know what, if you don't use Office 365, we're gonna make it real simple for you. We're gonna email you a passcode when you try and log in, take that number, you got 30 minutes, plug it in, use it, click the keep me signed in if you want, and you're signed in for 30 days if that's the policy that's set up, and then 30 days later, you repeat that process, and it's really friction-free from that point of view. And Microsoft, even though it's still in preview, they've actually announced publicly that as of March 2021, that's actually the only way that people who don't have an Office 365 account can come in. So, check it out if you don't already use it. Probably want to light it up because it's the direction Microsoft's going, and they're going to be pushing everybody that way. Anyways, Ben, we chatted about this one. Option. Yeah, it's just so much better from a user experience point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of my point about, yeah, it's great that lists are coming into Teams and that, we could do a hyperlink to push them into Teams, but if they're not a Teams user, there's a lot of stuff there and it's going to be a little overwhelming. So if we can dumb that down and keep it simple for them and say, okay, this is your customer portal, this is your volunteer portal, your donor portal, whatever the case is, and just the only little bits that you need to care about are here and nothing else confusing you.
Which is what we liked about the OneDrive request a link experience.
Exactly.
Remove all the noise. Here's the link, drop files, thank you, have a good day.
Yeah.
Definitely something I do hope will come to regular SharePoint document libraries.
Yeah, so if we can take that idea, kind of further in this concept of structured extranets, I'd still see SharePoint being a really strong proponent of building that simple interface. And if we can bring just a little bit of Teams into that without overwhelming people, great. If we can, do other things like that to keep it simple, great.
So what I explain to people, especially on this topic, is to remember earlier I said it's separate authentication or membership, from sharing. Sharing is taking an object and sharing it to people. Membership is who belongs in my security groups in AD. And Teams and SharePoint, team sites, and all these collaboration aspects, they're driven by Office 365 groups. So if we're talking about Office 365 group membership, this is where things can be like what we're talking about, more not complicated, but you gotta a lot more to worry about and a lot more to look into. Whereas
this is where we get into B2B and that whole side of things.
Exactly. Whereas SharePoint, when you're thinking about creating that extranet you're talking about and sharing it to external people, and SharePoint being very powerful for that scenario, it's because what you're doing is you're only taking SharePoint and you're sharing it to these outside people. rather than making them belong to an AD security group called an Office 365 group, and now have to manage this Teams and this and this and the other. But go ahead, yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I mean, we can even go further than that and say, okay, well, what about creating a portal outside of Office 365 or inside of Office 365? I mean, there's a number of options you can do for that. I mean, you can obviously roll your own. There's Graph API to let you invite people in and automate that process. It's a fair bit of work. It's why our product exists, but you can do that. There's stuff as part of Azure Active Directory called entitlement management, where you can build these packages to onboard. There's licensing implications there. There's what we do here. I mean, maybe to make this a little more real for people, these are a couple of real world examples that you can go to of these kinds of external portals, where some of them, like the Ontario MD site, is actually publicly available. So the bulk of the content is published from Office 365 to an Azure website, and anybody in the world can see it. It is truly anonymous. But there is a sign-in, there is a registration, there is private areas of content, and having that governance in place to say, if I put this here in Office 365, it ends up in this secure private area in the portal, and I know that there's rules around how people onboard into that and work with that from there. You can get very flexible in terms of creating something that's easy for the consumer, so that idea of friction-free and user experience, that still satisfies what we need from an information security point of view.
I think that's the key. Christopher asked a question about the login process for external users always being painful. Yeah, we've all experienced that, and provided feedback back to Microsoft. And I think that's part of what, Peter, what you were just talking about. Hey, you have these different options depending on the security and compliance rules that you need to have in place there, depending on what kind of collaboration is going to be there. You can make it a fairly seamless process for people to go and log in. It can be as strict as you need it to be.
Yeah, and we didn't talk about the G Suite scenario. So that's another preview feature from Microsoft, where they've actually enabled federation with Google. So I can sign into Office 365 with my @gmail.com email address. It doesn't address the scenario where a business has adopted G Suite as their email provider, and they've actually got a custom email domain in there, because Microsoft doesn't know that that's Google under the hood when they look at the email address. But if it is gmail.com, you can actually say, yeah, we allow that and we want to bring those people in. I mean, that's one that, depending on your organization, you may say, we don't want Gmail users in our corporate extranet, but in other ones where you're trying to broadly communicate with people, it's actually a nice scenario.
Yeah, but I find what was interesting, and I think your next slide was really when you want an external user to come and log in through a certain experience, especially for these external or publishing scenarios, that's where, again, either you roll your own, connect to the Graph API, and you build it all out, or you take something like Extranet User Manager, which is interesting because in that sense, you customize and you tailor the experience of someone from outside having to come in. And as we can see from the Ontario Association of Children's Aid Societies right in front of middle, where you really have this experience that you cater to the content that you want to access afterwards, or whatever that experience may be. And for me, that's really a whole other scenario where we talked about collaborative scenarios, but here we're talking about publishing scenarios. And if you want to tailor, customize, and craft that external behavior or the external login, which we do know is a pain point, that's where things like this become interesting, in my opinion.
So it's funny you'd say that, because I mean, something as simple as, okay, we want to streamline and simplify a sign-in registration process. Sounds like a simple task. You'd be amazed, how much effort goes into saying, okay, what are all the different paths people can go through, and how do we make that as optimized as possible? Even the simple thing of, hey, I don't remember if I have an account on your portal or not. How do you make that simple? People try and register when they've already registered. We said, you know what, let's take that away and let's just have people type in an email address, and we'll tell them if they have an account to sign in, or if they don't, to go through the registration. And there's some privacy things around that as to whether you want people to be able to harvest who your members are, and there's balancing things of security and user experience. It actually gets really complex trying to sort that out. But what we've tried to do is hide that complexity and say, you know what, we've thought about all those scenarios, and let's make it easy for your people to come in. Because the point made in the questions was, if this onboarding experience is a pain point, unless there's a really high value, like I need to pay my taxes to the CRA or to the IRS, as soon as I hit some friction, I'm going to drop off, and you're going to lose me as an external user in your portal. So we got to work really hard to make that as simple as possible. So I know we're almost at the top of the hour. It's been a great discussion. It was kind of free form, which was the intent, which I love. We don't know exactly where it's going to go, and we've had great feedback from questions and such that have guided that as well. Only one that we got to go back and dig into. So just kind of wrapping it up, thinking about are the box unstructured, the team side of things, that whole question of do I invite people into my team, this concept of structured extranets and how you publish content out. All things to think about from that perspective. A couple events just to wrap up on. We're going to be doing a number of sessions at Comsverse, which is based in London, UK, but they're actually doing North America as well as EMEA and Asia time slot presentations in there, and then ECS hopefully in the fall of 2020. So Ben, Christian, thanks so much for joining. It's been a great conversation. I love these kind of dialogues back and forth. It's been wonderful.
Thank you very much for inviting. Very, very fun conversation.
Awesome.
Thanks a lot, Peter.
All right. Take care, everybody, and have a great rest of your day. Stay safe.
Thank you.